The term Kush refers to an ancient kingdom in the Middle Nile region, between the First Cataract and the Khartoum area, and lasted as a political entity until the 4th century AD. From the end of the 25th dynasty, when the kings ruled both Kush and Egypt until the 3rd century BC, the kingdom was often called the Kingdom of Napata, named after one of its main centers. From the 3rd century BC to the 4th century AD, it was referred to as the Kingdom of Meroe, named after another of its central locations. In a strict sense, Nubia refers to two regions: Lower Nubia, located between the First and Second Cataracts, and Upper Nubia, situated between the Second and Fifth Cataracts. The term Ancient Nubia is a general reference to the ancient civilizations and cultures in the Middle Nile region. The territory of Ancient Nubia spans across two modern countries: Egypt, which includes Lower Nubia from the First Cataract to Maharaka, now submerged under Lake Nasser, and Sudan, which covers the area south of Maharaka. Ancient Egyptians referred to Nubia as Ta Seti, meaning the land of the archers. In the 19th century, Egyptology boomed as scholars decoded hieroglyphs, revealing the wonders of ancient Egypt. Excitement grew among European Egyptologists, who hoped to uncover even older relics further south along the Nile. Carl Richard Lepsius, a Prussian archaeologist, embarked on such a quest and reached Meroe in Sudan in 1844, hoping to find ancient Egyptian treasures. However, he discovered pyramids that didn't match the Egyptian style, leading him to conclude they belonged to a separate civilization, Nubia. Historically, this region has often been portrayed as poorly understood, a vassal territory under Egyptian control, a distinct and opposing entity to Egypt, or as the land of the Black Pharaohs of the 25th dynasty. Since the 19th century, during the peak of Western imperialism and the recognition of Egypt as one of the greatest civilizations in history, efforts have been made to obscure the truth about Egypt's African roots. At that time, racist ideologies classified Black people as non-human, making it unacceptable to acknowledge that they were the founders of this influential culture. As a result, there has been a concerted effort to separate Sudan, associated with the Black world, from ancient Egypt, creating an artificial divide between the two. Early scholars of Nubian history characterized the Egyptian-Nubian relationship in terms of conqueror and conquered, initiator and follower, model and imitation. David Asheri, a Western historian, in a notable recent work on the history of Nile Valley civilizations, stated, "The Egyptians were familiar with most of the Nubian region. They dominated it for 1,500 years, colonized it, and introduced their culture there." The site of Kerma in Nubia has a rich history, documented as early as 1820 in travel accounts. American archaeologist George Reisner conducted the first excavations at Kerma between 1913 and 1916. Despite the limited finds due to extensive looting at the site, Reisner concluded that Kerma was an Egyptian colony. Contemporary scholars like Mathieu Honegger are now acknowledging Reisner's misinterpretation of the true history of Nubia. Reisner's belief in an Egyptian origin for Kerma was influenced by the prevailing biases of his time, which regarded the so-called sub-Saharan people of Africa as incapable of producing advanced civilizations independently. Consequently, Reisner's interpretation overlooked the indigenous development of Kerma and its distinct cultural identity. The Nubian origins of Egyptian civilization, although recognized by official Egyptology, have been suppressed. The Egyptians have always been clear about their Nubian origin. As Cheikh Anta Diop states in his book, Nations, Negres et Culture, the Egyptians themselves, if we acknowledge that they were in the best position to speak about their origins, unequivocally recognized that their ancestors came from Nubia and the heart of Africa. Nubia's geographical position connects it not only to Egypt, but also to the African Great Lakes region and southern and central Africa, where modern humans first emerged about 300,000 years ago. These regions were the origin of the first populations that settled and developed Nubia during prehistoric times. As detailed in our recent video on the African origins of civilization, the Great Lakes in southern Africa were the sites of the earliest theoretical knowledge in history, including mathematics, astronomy, religion, and the first permanent constructions. In a scientific paper titled From the Great Lakes to the Fayoum, The Odyssey of Fishermen, published in the African Egyptology journal Ankh, Senegalese historian Babacar Sall demonstrates that the first black populations to civilize Nubia were initially fishermen from the African Great Lakes and surrounding regions. These populations gradually migrated down the Nile, bringing with them a lifestyle deeply connected to water, including water-related rituals, sacred rivers, navigation, and boat construction. The cartography of Africa during the Pharaonic era reflects the ancient Egyptians' view of the continent's orientation. They identified three main regions: Ta Njer, Ta Neta, the Holy Land, which corresponds to the Great Lakes region, Ta Seti, Nubia, and Ta Meri, Egypt. Egypt and Nubia were populated through migrations originating from the Great Lakes region of Africa. The populations of the Great Lakes region, with their accumulated knowledge since the dawn of humanity, were gradually joined in the Nile Valley by hunters, gatherers, and especially herders. The fusion of these diverse cultures in the Nile Valley led to the formation of Nubian civilization during prehistoric times. From this Nubia, the meeting point of African populations, emerged the black populations, such as the Anu, who would go on to civilize various regions of the world. For example, the name Canaanites, referring to the black Phoenician civilizers of the so-called Near East, comes from Kin Anu, descended from the Anu. Among the Sumerians, the first black civilizers of Mesopotamia, one of the names for God was Anu. The Sabaeans, the first black and animist civilizers of South Arabia, were also of Anu origin. In India, the Dravidians, the first black civilizers, called their god Agni. The first black inhabitants of Japan were known as the Ainu. This clearly shows how populations from the Great Lakes, formed in Nubia, spread civilization throughout Asia. It was also from Nubia that those who would later be called the ancient Egyptians originated. The Egyptians themselves referred to their ancestors as Anu. This illustration shows Terancher, chief of the Anu tribe from the interior of Africa, was an early founder of ancient Egypt. The French Egyptologist Abbé Émile Amelino is credited with discovering the Anu and recognizing their contribution to Egyptian civilization. Amelino identified the Anu as the first black race to occupy Egypt. He demonstrated how they gradually migrated down the Nile and founded the cities of Esne, Ermen, Kush, and Heliopolis. These Anu were an agricultural people, raising cattle on a large scale along the Nile and living in walled cities for protection. We can confidently attribute to them the earliest Egyptian texts, such as the Book of the Dead and the Pyramid texts, and consequently all related myths and religious teachings. Additionally, they likely developed almost all the philosophical systems that we still associate with ancient Egypt. The Anu were skilled in the crafts essential to any civilization and were familiar with the necessary tools. They knew how to use elementary metals and made the first attempts at writing. Egyptian tradition attributes this art to Thoth, who is referred to as Onion in the Book of the Dead and the Pyramid texts. The Anu demonstrated their knowledge of the principal arts, as evidenced by the architecture of the tombs at Abydos, especially the tomb of Osiris. Artifacts found in these tombs, such as carved ivory, a small head of a Nubian girl, and small wooden or ivory receptacles in the form of a feline head, all bear the unmistakable mark of their origin. These findings are documented in the first volume of my Fouilles d'Abydos. Egyptians, through documents like the Turin Royal Papyrus, dated the beginnings of their civilization to as far back as 40,000 years ago. This perspective helps us understand Diodorus Siculus' statement in his Universal History book. The Ethiopians say that the Egyptians are one of their colonies, led into Egypt by Osiris. They add that this country was initially a sea, but later, the Nile, carrying silt from Ethiopia, eventually filled it in and made it part of the continent. It's important to note that the term Ethiopian means burnt face or black face in Greek. When the Greeks referred to Ethiopians, they were generally speaking about the populations within the African continent, including the Nubians, rather than the inhabitants of present-day Ethiopia. Diodorus Siculus tells us that the Egyptians were actually groups of Nubians who settled in the extreme north of the Nile Valley, Egypt and the Nile Delta. This area, which didn't exist for millennia due to being covered by the sea, became habitable over time due to the actions of the Nile and the retreat of the Mediterranean Sea. Diodorus Siculus continues, "The Ethiopians also say that most Egyptian customs originated in Ethiopia, as colonies often preserved the traditions of their homeland. Respect for kings as gods, funeral rites, and many other customs are Ethiopian institutions. Additionally, the types of sculpture and writing are borrowed from the Ethiopians. The Egyptians have two distinct forms of writing. One, called vulgar, which is learned by everyone, and the other, called sacred, known only to priests and passed down secretly from father to son. However, the Ethiopians use both scripts interchangeably. All the key processes that gradually led to the birth of Egypt, such as the mythical confrontation between Osiris and Seth, the emergence of pharaonic kingship with the Shemsu-Hor, followers of Horus, and the unification of Egypt, took place in Nubia under the leadership of Pharaohs, who preceded Pharaoh Naremari. This is confirmed by American archaeologist Bruce Williams, who has studied artifacts from excavations in southern Egypt and Sudan. Writing in the UNESCO Courier, February of 1980, he states, "Thanks to evidence from the El Cemetery, the period just before the First Dynasty is now recognized as a historical epoch. An astonishing fact emerges, completely contrary to previous ideas. For at least 9 generations, from 3500 to 3100 BC, Nubia of Group A was a unified state with all the attributes of civilization. A government, a pharaoh, officials, an official religion, a script, and monuments. It was a state strong enough to unite diverse peoples, the inhabitants of Tasseti, the land of the bow, as the ancient Egyptians called Nubia, participated fully and equally in the development of civilization along the Nile, something previously unrecognized. The Scorpion Pharaoh, one of the pharaohs who ruled before Naremari, Narmer, is the oldest known depiction of a pharaoh. This pharaoh was Nubian. The only visual evidence of the Scorpion Pharaoh's existence is the scorpion mace head, discovered by archaeologists James E. Quibell and Frederick W. Green in a temple at Nakon, Hierakonpolis, during the 1897-1898 excavation season. This artifact is now on display at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Although the exact layer where it was found was not recorded, its style suggests it dates to the end of the pre-dynastic period. The scorpion mace head shows a large figure wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt and holding a hoe. This has been interpreted as a ceremonial act, either symbolizing the pharaoh cutting the first furrow in the fields or opening the dikes to flood them. The Nubians practiced matriarchy, circumcision, totemism, and monotheism with one god, Amani, also known as Amun, who manifested in various forms such as Isis, Osiris, Thoth, and Horus, similar to Egypt. While some architectural styles were unique to Nubia, examples include Defufas and Tumulus. The pharaonic civilization essentially began as the Nubian civilization in prehistoric times. It evolved into Egyptian civilization in antiquity, spreading throughout the lower Nile Valley to the delta. This is why the first Egyptian pharaohs were actually Nubian. The foundation of pharaonic civilization was Nubian, indicating that the Sudanese ruled Egypt long before the 25th dynasty, contrary to Western claims. Sheikh Anta Diop states in Nations Negres et Culture, until the end of the Egyptian Empire, the kings of Nubia bore the same title as the pharaoh of Egypt, that of Sparrowhawk of Nubia. This indicates that all Egyptian pharaohs acknowledged and embraced their Sudanese origins and the Nubian roots of pharaonic kingship. This connection is further evidenced by the fact that many of Egypt's defense and security forces were often composed of Nubian warriors. Diop also mentions that the priestess of Amun, or god, of Thebes, the holiest site in Egypt, could only be a Sudanese Meroitic. He further notes that Diodorus Siculus reported an annual ritual where the statue of Amun, the king of Thebes, was taken to Nubia for a few days before being returned, symbolizing the god's connection to Nubia. Herodotus also learned from Egyptian priests that out of the 300 pharaohs from Menes, Naremari, to the 17th dynasty, 18, and not just the 3 from the Ethiopian dynasty, were of Sudanese origin. This means that besides the Sudanese pharaohs referred to as Black Pharaohs by the West, there were 18 others after Nare-Mari who were born in Nubia, along with many others born in Egypt who were also black. The term Black Pharaoh is therefore misleading. Nubia, rich in minerals and precious metals, supplied Egypt with precious stones like gold and lapis lazuli. Its strategic location also provided Egypt with goods from the heart of Africa, such as leopard skins and incense. The pharaohs traded with Nubia and often undertook construction projects there, including temples. Furthermore, monumental pyramid constructions also occurred in Sudan, resulting in the Nubians building over 220 pyramids, about 3 times the number in Egypt. The Egyptian military included soldiers from Nubia, as evidenced by artifacts in the Nubian Museum in Aswan, Egypt. However, the relationship between Egypt and Nubia was often fraught with tension. The influential Nubian states, particularly the Kingdom of Kuso, also known as Kush, frequently resisted Egyptian attempts at territorial consolidation, leading to conflicts and wars. Egypt frequently annexed Nubian territories by force. Evidence of these conflicts can be seen in depictions of war captives from both Egyptian and Nubian sides, such as those found in frescoes, dating to the time of Ramaso Mariamana. This suggests that both Egyptians and Nubians took each other as prisoners of war. The remains of the temple of Imanahotep Hekawaset, popularly known as Amenhotep III, located north of the Kushite kingdom in Soleb, Nubia, dating back to the 18th Egyptian dynasty, indicate the extent of Egyptian presence and influence in Nubia. Similar constructions left by other pharaohs further attest to Egypt's long-standing connection with Nubia. As Egypt's power waned around 1070 BC, the kingdom of Kush gained independence and grew politically influential. During this period, when Egypt faced challenges, the Sudanese, called upon by their Egyptian counterparts, intervened to save and govern Egypt under the legitimate rule of pharaohs such as Pianki, Shabaka, Shabataka, Taharka, and Bakare Tantamani. This era, known as the 25th Dynasty, marked Egypt's last significant period of prosperity beyond its traditional borders until the Sudanese pharaohs were defeated by the Assyrians in 663 BC, leading to Egypt's eventual absorption into the Roman Empire in 30 BC. Despite Roman attempts to control Nubia, they were thwarted by one of the remarkable pharaoh queens, Kandake Amanirenas, who not only defeated them, but also expanded Nubian territories into Egypt. Eventually, peace treaties were negotiated with her. Following this, the Meroitic period saw stability for Kush, lasting over 300 years, until the empire fragmented into 3 Christianized black kingdoms. These kingdoms maintained alliances and cultures, influenced by ancient Nile Valley civilizations. In the 14th century, Arab Muslim forces conquered Egypt and gradually extended their influence over Nubia, leading to its Islamization. This process contributed to the Arab Muslim identity of present-day Sudan. Despite these transformations, Nubia, with its rich African heritage and legacy as the cradle of black civilizations, retains a history rooted in African prehistory until around the 14th century AD, while Egypt eventually succumbed to various conquerors. The Gedi Sabu rock art site in Sudan hosts over 1,600 well-preserved rock paintings, spanning 6,000 years of Nubian civilization. Located 600 kilometers north of Khartoum, it features depictions of animals, humans, and boats. Threatened by the construction of the Kajbar Dam, it was added to the World Observatory of Monuments list in 2016 for urgent preservation. The plans for dam construction have been finally cancelled by the Sudanese government. This is welcome news for those dedicated to the preservation of African history. As we conclude our journey through the ancient civilization of Nubia, we hope you've enjoyed exploring the rich heritage, remarkable achievements, and enduring legacy of this incredible culture. But this is just the beginning. Stay tuned for more exciting videos where we'll delve deeper into Nubian history, uncovering fascinating stories from Africa. Thank you so much for watching. We'd love to hear your thoughts and any questions you have in the comments below. Your engagement helps us create more content that you love. Until next time, remain black and proud. Until the lions have their own historians, the tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.